Hello everyone, this is my final project presentation. Today I will be introducing and showcasing the K-Medoids algorithm. So for a little background of the problem, in order to find groups of similar objects in data systems or in data sets, there is a method used called clustering. So this is really when data is grouped by common attributes. So there are already many clustering algorithms out there, with the most famous being the K-means algorithm. But we'll not be going over the K-means algorithm. Today we're going over the K-Medoids, which is similar, but it has a twist. So if you look here on the bottom, in the bottom left, we have some unlabeled data. After going through the K-means, you can see how each of these data sets are clustered. And we have a green, red, and blue. And if you look at the X's, that's where the centroids, which is created during the K-means algorithm, are placed. So there's a big difference between the K-means and K-Medoids is where K-means utilizes centroids and K-Medoids, of course, utilizes medoids. And so, this is just really how clustering is done. So what's the goal of our algorithm? The goal really is just to correctly group this data into appropriate sections, to take care of noise and outliers in data, and also, of course, for this algorithm to be efficient. So what is the K-Medoid algorithm? The K-Medoid is an unsupervised machine learning technique since it does not utilize labels in order to compute. While a K-means algorithm finds the distance between data points and assigns them to centroids, the K-Medoids utilizes medoids. So a medoid is really a point in a cluster that has the smallest average dissimilarity to all other points in that set. So if you look at the top right, these are two separate clusters, and this is utilizing the K-Medoids algorithm. And if you look at where these neon circles are, they are directly over data points. So the reason why this is important is because the K-means algorithm does not utilize a data point in order to calculate the distance. It utilizes the sum of the means of all of the data points and will assign a point in space, which is what we call the centroid. But in K-Medoids, we actually use a data point, and that data point is then compared to all of the other data points. And depending on the distance from one to another, that is how these are grouped or clustered, we should say. So that is really the main difference between K-Medoid and K-means. So a little bit more. So usually when the algorithm is run, we will specify how many clusters we want, and depending on how many clusters that we specify, that is how many medoids will be generated. So then whichever data points are closer to whichever medoid, they will be grouped accordingly. So K-Medoids has a time complexity of big O nkt, where n is the number of data points, k is the amount of clusters, and t is the amount of iterations. So implementation and design. So to find the most straightforward way, I really want to find a programming language and some libraries where the logic is simplified. And I found that scikit has a really extensive machine learning library that makes it very simple to showcase the algorithm. I utilized Python with NumPy and scikit in order to complete this project. So once I knew which programming language and libraries I want to use, the first part of the showcase utilizes a single data set, but there are variances in the distances and the amount of clusters. The second part of the showcase I found this website called Kaggle, which offers free data sets, and so I utilized one of those. And then the program will just model how K-Medoids outputs clusters at 3, 4, and 5. So processing and cleaning the data. So the data, like I said before, is completely random and is generated upon runtime. And for the first part, it utilizes an 8x8 image, and where the second part will, of course, use a data set from Kaggle. And this data set is information on smartwatch prices. So to clean the data, we then standardize it along the x-axis. So we do this by calculating the mean and the standard deviations. And then the reason why we do this is we want to center and scale the data so that it fits. And in scikit, we can load data sets and scale using their built-in scale functionality. Calculation process. So once we have our data set, we want to set the boundaries for our cluster so that they fit onto our graph, and then of course assign each of these clusters a color. After, we will then compute the distance of data points to one another and find our medoid point. So for the first part of the showcase, I used the Manhattan, Euclidean, and cosine distance. And then once we have our medoids and clusters on our grid, we'll then just need to plot this onto our graph, and then we'll be complete. So now we'll go over the code demonstration. So just going over the code a little bit. These are all the libraries I utilized. So NumPy, scikit, Seaborn, which is a separate graphing library, and then pandas for data science. So this is the first part. We load our 8x8 image. We're going to standardize it using the scale. We're going to go through our data set, make sure we have no unique values, or only unique values, I should say. We're going to do a PCA, or component analysis on it. This reason why we're doing this, to reduce the dimensionality to 2 dimensions, and then so that in order for this to fit onto our graph. Then we're going to set our boundaries for our graph. So here, of course, we have our height and our x mins, x maxes, y mins, y maxes, and then create our mesh grid with this. So here I utilized 3 different models. So for the first model, we utilized Manhattan, and that one's going to have 3 clusters. Then I utilized the Euclidean distance, and that one's going to have 4 clusters, and then the cosine distance, which is going to use 5 clusters. Then we specify how many rows and how many columns. Then we're going to clear if we have a graph already. And then for each of these models, we're going to place them onto our graph, and then it'll be complete. So the rest of this is really just putting in our points, setting the colors, and then finding our medoids. So if we were to run this, we'll press to continue. Here we go. You can see here that we have 3 separate graphs. In this first one, we have the Manhattan metric, the Euclidean metric, and cosine metric. And you can see how each of these are clustering them. So the first one has 3, second one has 4, and fifth one has 5. So wherever these red X's are, that is where our medoid is placed. And these medoids are directly on top of a data point. And with that data point, of course, we then group each of our clusters accordingly. So you can see how each of them get a separate color based on which cluster it is a part of. So now for the second part, let's go over the code for our second part of the showcase. So this one, I utilize a data set from Kaggle, and so this is based on smartwatch prices. So the first part is really just to assign our graph, make sure we initialize it. Then we're going to read in our data set from our files. Then we go through our values. So let's put this here. I'm just gonna put this aside for a second. So if you look here on the bottom, after doing our calculation of our CSV from our data set, we get all of these different components. But the attributes we're going to be using for this clustering algorithm is the price and the display size. So here I said use columns 4 and 11. 4 is the display size, and the 11th column is the price. And of course, we grab the values. Then we're going to be clustering them into 5 separate clusters. We're going to fit and predict them onto our graph. And then finally, we just put them onto our scatter plot, and then we are complete. So let's go take a look at our graph. So this is the graph we get after we have finished. You can see that in our top cluster, we're directly over data point, which is what we want. And it is clustering each of these accordingly. So you can see that right here, once the price gets around 250, that is when, or gets higher than 250, that is when the different clusters kind of separate. So 500 and below is gray, and then 250 and below is blue. And so this is just another way to group our data using clustering, or K-Medoids clustering algorithm. And so that is our results from there. Next, after our code demonstration, it's just some analysis. I showed you this. This is just for the presentation. So some of the pros and cons of the K-Medoids algorithm. So the pros, it's very easy to understand. It is not sensitive to outliers. Reason why that's a big pro is because the K-means algorithms is the sum of all of the means of all of the points. So when there are outliers in K-means, that will affect where the centroid gets placed, and so that can affect where the cluster is formed. And that is very important because that means that noise can very heavily affect the K-means. But that's not an issue with K-Medoids since we don't use sums. We simply only look at the distance. Another pro, it's very fast when compared to other clustering algorithms. It's very easy to implement and it outputs clusters in a fixed amount of iterations always. So our cons, so the overall computation depends on the initial partition. And because it is not sensitive, it will always include outliers into the clusters. So there's no real way to take them out unless you clean the data beforehand. So it can obtain different results on the same data set since the first K-Medoid is chosen randomly. So this can happen, not always, but it can happen. And another con is that you will have to specify how many clusters you want in advance. So that is a con since you will have to use a separate technique in order to determine how many clusters you will need. So that is the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed, and yep, that's all for me. Thank you.